Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so my microphone died in the middle of recording this video, so I had to re-record it, which kind of sucks. But what I want to do in this video is I want to talk about mutant classifications versus mutant power, like a mutant power hierarchy, mutant power rankings. And the reason why is because people, I think, often confuse these things, right? They consider classifications to be the mutant power hierarchy, and that's not really true. Classifications I always consider to be more of an indication of like what kind of group mutants belong to in terms of like the history of mutants over the course of Marvel, and then powers are just powers. And we'll talk about powers here in a second, but in terms of classifications, this is pretty wide and varying, right? So for those of you guys who have been around my channel for a while and who have heard this explanation, and really I most recently had it in my video on the Eternals, bear with me for a second while I kind of run over it for the people who are new here. But with regards to mutants, their origin goes back to like the Eternals and the Celestials, right? The Celestials showed up on Earth, they modified the genes of a handful of early men. One group went forward as the Deviants, which were basically trolls. Another group went forward as the Eternals, who were more angelic in appearance, right? In terms of the fact that they were to some degree immortal. Really, they were truly immortal, to be honest. And then they also had the ability to manipulate like cosmic energy. They could fly, different things like that. And so early depictions by mankind in terms of how they view the Eternals is that they were basically gods. And then you had baseline humans. Now the genes, as they were modified by the Celestials regarding baseline humans, they were just sent out into the world. What we ended up finding out later on is that the genes were modified in two ways. The first is that X genes were planted in some of them, and then in the others, their genes were simply modified in such a way so that when the time came when they were bestowed with powers, they wouldn't die in the process, right? So that explains why Bruce Banner didn't die when he was exposed to gamma radiation. It explains why Steve Rogers didn't die when he was injected with the super soldier serum and blasted with Vita rays, right? It explains why those things happen and why they turned into superheroes as opposed to just dying from radiation sickness, because the genes, as they were modified by the Celestials, lent themselves to developing powers. Now, in terms of following this sort of classification order, it actually kind of goes in a pretty linear progression, right? And so the earliest mutants that we saw start to rise to prominence were effectively externals. Now, the question is, what are externals? These are mutants who are legitimately immortal, right? I mean, they're immune to like aging, they're immune to disease, illness, anything that could cause physical harm on their body. They're immune to all those things. Now, it does not mean they have a healing factor, and it does not mean they're indestructible, right? Immortality and indestructibility are two distinctly different things. Immortality, as it's explained, or really as it's defined by Marvel Comics, is simply just the inability to die of old age. That's basically what immortality is. So the traditional definition. Invulnerability is, of course, invulnerability, the inability to sustain physical harm. For characters like Selene, for example, she's defined as an external, but not really, and I'll talk about why here in a second. But characters like Gideon, for example, are. Now with Selene, she's a character, the reason why she's not really an external is because for a character like Gideon, he'll just live forever, right? I mean, he was born into the world, his mutant gene activated probably around puberty, and he basically developed true immortality. Now, because he's not invulnerable, his head was chopped off by Cable in the 1990s, and he's basically been dead ever since. And then I think he came back recently. I don't know. Honestly, Gideon was never really that important, so I never really cared. He was in the early stories of Cable, but in terms of the modern day, it doesn't really matter. But with someone like Selene, she has to drain the life energy off people in order to sustain her essence, in order to keep herself alive. So she's not truly immortal, right? The same thing goes for someone like Apocalypse, but Apocalypse is kind of a mixed situation, right? Because Selene was born 10,000 years ago, Apocalypse was born 5,000 years later, and he was a character who developed immortality when his mutant gene activated during a high level of stress, and then in turn, he later discovered celestial technology that allowed him to modify his body even further, and then give himself virtually every single superhuman power. So you could argue that he's an external because he was legitimately immortal, but Marvel's never clearly defined that, right? They've never really come out and said Apocalypse is an external. We're just kind of left to sort of make that decision for ourselves, and then just kind of go from there. From there, you get into what are called Proto Mutants. Now, there were a handful of mutants here and there that, kind of a smattering around the world that popped up between 5,000 years ago and probably around 700 or 800 years ago. But Marvel's never really defined them, right? They're just kind of like some remains that were found somewhere, and then that's basically it. Mutants that Marvel's written in such a way where they claim to have been around since like the very beginnings of life on Earth, so like they're billions of years old. But none of those things have ever really been confirmed by anybody. It's just a statement someone made, right? So until such a time as a character makes a statement in terms of what class they belong to, and then the story is written in a way where another character goes to investigate and then confirms it, then we can't really assume that it's true. We just kind of have to go with it and make up our own minds on what we do or do not want to believe. But in terms of anywhere between 700 to 800 years ago, probably around 600 years ago, you had Proto Mutants, and Proto Mutants were kind of a branch off from other mutants that were popping up around that point in time. The difference between Proto Mutants and traditional mutants is that Proto Mutants almost kind of had like a wild, unchecked kind of power, right? In the sense that like they were kind of pushed to the extreme, and we didn't really know what sort of power they would manifest, and in reality we don't really know much about them at all. All we really know is what it is that Gabriel Shepard told us, or at least how his character was written in Marvel Comics, in the sense that he was just one of the Proto Mutants who was there. Pretty much all of them were wiped out in Macedonia during the Black Plague, or at least as being believed to be the cause of the Black Plague, and he's the only one left. But looking at the power that he has, we could largely assume that most of the Proto Mutants during that time had power, similar to that, if not almost identical, right? So he has the ability to stop time in a localized space. He has the ability to manipulate reality on really what seems to be a universal scale, but there's no absolute definition of that. He can manipulate the electromagnetic spectrum, he can fly, he has telepathy, telekinesis, he has a huge wide array of different powers. Different fans have kind of argued that he was the ideal candidate for the Celestials. When they first started modifying the genes of early man, he's what they were supposed to be. It wasn't until later that Marvel came back and confirmed that it was actually Franklin Richards, right? Because Franklin Richards turning out the way he did, he was what the Celestials were looking for when they started modifying the genes of man, right? Like, he was the verification that their experiment succeeded, is essentially what it was, right? Like, somebody on the same power level as themselves, if not maybe even a little bit higher. But following Proto Mutants, that's when you really go into like the modern day level of mutants, right? Like the modern day era of mutants, where you just kind of have different people with different powers all over the place. I mean, to me, those are the three main classifications. There are characters like Homo Supreme, like Mr. Immortal, who is a legitimately immortal guy, right? Like, if he dies, he'll just be reborn in a different form. Or maybe that's a forever man. He'll always end up coming back, basically. But the gist behind this is that in terms of this classification of different versions of powers and so on and so forth, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? And unless a person is guaranteed to be, or at least stated to be, part of a particular class, you can just kind of throw them anywhere depending on what era they were born in, right? Now, where that's a little bit murky, powers get even more murkier. And the reason why is because if we take something like Omega level mutant, right, like we take that term, for the most part, that's a term that originated in Uncanny X-Men number 207. A lot of people say Uncanny X-Men 208. That's actually not correct. 207 is where it first originated at, and in turn, it was just kind of a one-off, right? It was just sort of thrown out there as a way to indicate this mutant is really, really powerful, and then we never really saw it again until we got X-Men Forever, and then Grant Morrison's run on the X-Men. Up until that point, during Chris Claremont's 17-year run, all you had were mutants, and some were more powerful than others, and that was basically it. Really, when you get into Grant Morrison's run, that's when we started to get a kind of hierarchy. But what you have now is if you go out and you do some Google searching, you'll see things like Epsilon mutants and like Gamma mutants and like Delta mutants and so on and so forth. Those are really more fan designations. The three main categories of mutants that Marvel's actually confirmed in terms of how mutants reside, running up to the point where Hickman started writing House of X, is that you have Beta, Alpha, and Omega, and that's basically it. Then you have Beyond Omega level, and we'll talk about how that applies to what Hickman's doing. But with regards to Beta level mutants, these are anybody whose powers are able to basically impact the world around them, but not in a very big way, right? Like, not in a huge way. So take, for example, someone like Beast, right? Like, Beast has enhanced strength and agility and things like that, and blue fur, and he's got a really, really smart mind, but he doesn't really possess the power to like alter the structure of the world or anything like that. You look at somebody like Wolverine, he's got a healing factor, right? I mean, his healing just kind of applies to him. It's a passive power, meaning that the power basically runs without him having to do anything about it. And then you've got like characters like Cyclops, for example. Cyclops, I would say, is more alpha, just because of the power he possesses and how dangerous it can be. But you look at someone like Cyclops, kind of moving into the alpha level territory here. You look at someone like Cyclops and you say he's an alpha level level mutant. Well, the question is why? Because he has his concussive blast can cut mountains in half, right? So he can have a huge impact on the world around him in terms of like loss of life or damage that can be sustained or something along those lines. It's kind of nuts in terms of the power he possesses. Then you go into Omega and beyond Omega level, and this is where things start to get not really murky. It's where they start to get a little clearer. And the reason why is because Grant Morrison clearly defined these things. And what he did is he basically said that an Omega level mutant is a mutant whose power can basically fundamentally alter the structure of the world, right? And then you have beyond Omega level where you take that concept and then apply it to the universe. They can alter the structure of the universe, right? Like those who can manipulate matter and energy to affect the world or the universe itself. So you look at someone like Bobby Drake, you look at Iceman. The reason why he's considered to be Omega level is because he's a guy that basically creates cold. Well, you can't really create cold. Cold is simply the absence of heat. And as a result of that, if heat is simply, atoms moving at a rapid pace, then what Bobby Drake is doing is basically slowing them down. But the issue with this is that his power can be surpassed because of what he's doing is essentially slowing down the movement of matter in order to create cold or something like that. He's affecting the world. But there's never been an instance where we've seen him affect the universe, right? So as far as, at least at this point in time, he's not beyond Omega level. You look at somebody like Storm. Storm can affect the weather phenomena of any world that she's on, but we've never seen her harness the power of a cosmic storm, like a storm raging and running throughout the universe, so there's no reason to believe that she is a beyond Omega level mutant. But then you look at someone like Franklin Richards, and Franklin Richards can alter the universe alter reality on a universal scale. And so because he can do things like that, that makes him beyond Omega level. His power stretches into the universe itself and is not just confined to his ability to affect Earth. With regards to Magneto, he was a character who was always listed as Alpha level, but I always argued he was Omega level. And this gets us into Jonathan Hickman's current run. What Jonathan Hickman is basically doing is he's removing the concept of beyond Omega level, right? Because in reality, it doesn't really make any sense. It's like 1 plus infinity. And in terms of this Omega beyond Omega level concept, what Hickman is doing is kind of reworking everything, using some of the traditional definitions and then combining it with his own. And so as it stands right now in Marvel, an Omega level mutant is a mutant whose power does not have any foreseeable upper limit and which nobody seems to be able to surpass, right? Now, it could simply be because nobody has a power like that, or because no one's demonstrated a power level equal to that person. So if we say someone like Magneto is a person who can manipulate the electromagnetic spectrum of Earth. But because of the fact that the electromagnetic spectrum is not just confined to Earth, but is also spread out into the universe itself, it's believed that he could possibly do that. But because we haven't seen anybody out there shy of maybe Polaris on a good day, and even then, it kind of depends, that's been able to rival Magneto's ability to control the electromagnetic spectrum, as it stands now, he's a top dog. And so as a result of that, he's an Omega level mutant. Now, in terms of the other thing Hickman's doing, is he's moving the Omega level classification away from the person and applying it to the power. Now, with someone like Magneto, he's only got one power. That's it. So you would call him an Omega level mutant. But with somebody like Jean Grey, as Hickman told us, she's an Omega level telepath. And the reason why is because she has telepathy and she has telekinesis. But her telekinesis is not powerful enough to move the Earth to the other side of the sun. It's not powerful enough to move the sun out of the Milky Way, out of the current solar system and into another solar system next to us. She's not powerful enough to do that with her telekinesis. Her telepathy, on the other hand, is powerful enough to influence the entire world. And if she's possessed by the power of the Phoenix Force, it's enough to influence the entire universe. And so because of that, with her telepathy being what it is, no one's as powerful as she is in terms of their telepathy, right? Like Emma Frost is not more powerful than she is. Professor X is not more powerful than she is. She's the most powerful telepath on Earth as it stands right now. And so because her power has not been surpassed, she's an Omega level telepath, not an Omega level telekinetic, and not an Omega level mutant. But you look at somebody like Emma Frost, she's got her diamond form, and it's a form she rarely ever uses, but because she has two powers, she's got her diamond form and her telepathy, you would call her an Omega level telepath. So again, that's kind of where things stand right now, but the one thing to bear in mind is that these are always subject to change, and that's one of the big reasons why these various mutant power levels, right, like Gamma and Epsilon and Delta and Beta and Alpha and Omega and beyond Omega level, it's one of the reasons why there's so much debate among fans is because you have writers who contradict other writers, you've got editors who contradict other editors, you've got all kinds of things, right? Like a person will create a standard, it'll run that way for 5 years, and then a new writer will take over and they'll just ignore everything that happened before and create a new standard. And the question is, which standard do you go with? So that's why things get kind of murky when it comes to this whole concept. So I imagine debates will reign supreme down in the comments section. It's really kind of the way these things work. I mean, it's just, I always saw it this way, so this way's right. I always saw it that way's right. But again, Hickman's kind of reworking all that, and he's kind of giving us a new definition for how all this stuff functions. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully this cleared things up a little bit. And if you guys have questions about like mutants in Marvel Comics, post them down in the comments section, and I'll go over them and I'll make sense of it and make videos like that, right? Because with what Hickman's doing with the X-Men, the fact that it's kind of a reboot, more or less, really not really a reboot so much as like a rework, but because of what he's doing, I imagine there'll be a lot of questions out there in terms of how mutants work, how they function, different things like that. But yeah, with that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.